In the beginning, Gene Roddenberry and his team created Star Trek, a clever science fiction show that played with the lofty ideals of the American empire, broke ground on how sci-fi could look and feel on television, and in the process gave color TV owners something colorful to look at. Look at all that color. The first episode aired in 1966, on September 8th. However, it all abruptly ended in 1969, just 3 brief years later. Canceled. Roddenberry and his production team had fought the good fight, but the network didn't see the value in it, so Star Trek slipped into the void. That is, until 1973.
Space, the final frontier.
When the Star Trek flag was handed to a new series, Star Trek the Animated Series. This animated experiment was an attempt to keep the Star Trek brand alive, stoking the hope that Star Trek could return to television sometime in the future as another live-action show. Today, this first animated series is regarded as the lost, forgotten sibling of the franchise. Most fans haven't even thought about watching it. Some fans don't even know it exists. But as the very first Star Trek spinoff, Star Trek the Animated Series helped to set the tone for what's possible in future Star Trek. And importantly, this first spinoff provided innovations to the Star Trek multiverse and influenced many subsequent Star Trek series and films. And that's exactly what we're going to cover today, influences from Star Trek's forgotten spinoff series. But first, how did this unlikely series even manage to leave spacedock? To answer that, we're going to need to discuss the business of Saturday morning cartoons. Star Trek the Animated Series debuted on September 8, 1973, exactly 7 years after the original series. It continued the stories of the USS Enterprise in animated form. The series featured most of the original cast, reprising their iconic roles, and it featured James Doohan as many voices apart from his marquee character, Montgomery Scott. The animation was produced by Filmation Productions, a newcomer to the animated industry that established a foothold in the business by encouraging partnerships with the owners of popular comic book properties. Norm Prescott, one of the principal founders of the Filmation studio, was interviewed for The Best Saturdays of Our Lives, a book by Mark McCray that chronicles how Saturday morning became a competitive business. In the interview, Prescott describes the Filmation business strategy.
We were trying to develop animation from scratch, and we were unable to break in. Hanna-Barbera was the #1 studio and had this unwritten credo of producing shows without partners. They would try to buy the property outright or create characters that were similar. In order for Filmation to make it, we had to become everybody's partners.
From 1966 to 1968, Filmation established successful partnerships with DC Comics, 20th Century Fox, Archie Comics, creating such hits as The New Adventures of Superman, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and The Archie Show. Filmation was in talks with Gene Roddenberry as early as 1969 about a Star Trek animated series. However, the opportunity for an animated version of Star Trek would have to wait for several more years until the appetites of Saturday morning audiences and the programming strategies of networks lined up to create a new phenomenon, the primetime to Saturday morning trend. This trend of creating animated versions of established primetime shows exploded in the fall of 1972-73, and it produced animated doppelgangers of popular primetime programming as TV series and as dueling TV movies of the week. The Saturday Superstar movie, which premiered on ABC, introduced animated versions of The Brady Bunch, Lassie, and Nanny and the Professor, while over at CBS, the new Scooby-Doo movies introduced the animated versions of The Addams Family and The Three Stooges. The movie franchises performed great for both networks. NBC was the only network not participating, but that soon changed. The executive who greenlit the Saturday Superstar movie, Joe Terratero, was lured from ABC over to NBC, home network of the original Star Trek series. This was done to hopefully improve NBC's Saturday morning ratings performance. Joe Terratero already had a relationship with Filmation Studios, so his executive move to NBC facilitated Filmation getting the Star Trek animated series contract. Prior to the 1973 season, Filmation did not have any success selling programming to NBC, which was strange since Filmation Studios was responsible for creating #1 ratings-driven programming on rival networks. Star Trek the Animated Series premiered on September 8, 1973. Also on Saturday, September 8th, the Saturday Superstar movie premiered a Lost in Space animated movie. Other primetime to Saturday morning series premieres in the fall of 1973 included animated versions of I Dream of Jeannie, My Favorite Martian, and Lassie's Rescue Rangers. The animated Star Trek series did much to move the Trek brand into the future, including winning the franchise's very first Emmy. But before we get into all that,
let's take a quick break. Hi, I'm Mark McCray. I wrote the essay this video is based on. I wanted to take a moment and tell you about my book, The Best Saturdays of Our Lives. The Best Saturdays of Our Lives chronicles how Saturday morning became a competitive business. There are interviews with people who worked in the industry during the Saturday morning years. The book also talks about programming trends from the 1960s all the way to the early digital age of the 1990s. Okay, now here comes the part where we talk about how Star Trek, the animated series, connects to and influences the rest of the Star Trek franchise. Enjoy the video.
Right out of the gate, Star Trek the Animated Series introduced new technology and ideas to the Star Trek franchise. For example, in an episode called Beyond the Farthest Star, audiences were introduced to the Life Support Belt, a personal force field device that provides the wearer with the right amount of atmosphere and protection against alien environments. The Aqua Shuttle, a shuttlecraft that doubled as a submarine, was introduced in the ambergris element. In addition to new technologies, new regular crew members were added to the cast of familiar faces. Communications Officer Imres, a Cation, and Lieutenant Eriks, an Edosian, joined the animated cast alongside Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy. We also get to meet Ensign Dawson Walking Bear, a Native American crew member created by Kiowa sci-fi writer Russell Bates. These innovations weren't lost on anyone. People were watching, and the animated series won over fans as well as Emmy voters. The fan favorite Yesteryear was nominated for an Emmy during the 1973-74 season. And of course, the animated series won an Emmy for How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth during the 1974-75 season.
The creative team that developed Star Trek the Animated Series, Filmation Studios, would have unexpected influences on the future of the Star Trek franchise. So let's cover some of those influences. Influence 1, Yesteryear.
The first big animated series influence on the larger franchise came from an episode called Yesteryear. In this one, Captain Kirk and Spock returned from a time-traveling adventure using the Guardian of Forever, a device which was originally featured in the fan-favorite episode The City on the Edge of Forever. It is discovered that Spock's original timeline has been altered. In this new timeline, Spock died at the age of 7 while going through the Kazwan ordeal on Vulcan. Spock must now use the Guardian of Forever to go back in time to save his younger self and restore his timeline. Yesteryear introduced audiences to Spock's intense coming-of-age story and established that Vulcans must go through a survival ritual early in life. In the 1991 Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Unification, Spock's father Sarek has a conversation with Captain Picard about Spock running away to the mountains.
I never knew what Spock was doing. When he was a boy, he would disappear for days into the mountains. I would ask him where he had gone, what he had done. He refused to tell me. I insisted that he tell me.
These mountains are believed to be the Vulcan Forge, mentioned in Yesteryear. In the 1997 Star Trek Voyager episode, Displaced, Tuvok tells Chakotay about the Rite of Taloth.
During the Rite of Taloth, I survived in the Vulcan desert for 4 months, with the ritual blade as my only possession. After that, Starfleet training exercises seemed less of a challenge. I guess so.
This is very similar to the Kazwan ordeal. In the 1995 Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode, Prophet Motive, the Vulcan title of Healer, a kind of Vulcan doctor, is resurrected from the Yesteryear episode. We finally get to see the Vulcan Forge region itself in a 3-part Star Trek Enterprise run of episodes in 2004. In these episodes, we get to see a CGI version of a Sela, a bear-like creature native to Vulcan. The young Spock in yesteryear kept one named Ichaya as a beloved pet.
Ichaya, go home. You are too old and too fat for this.
They're very persistent creatures. When I was a child, I had one as a pet.
You had one of those?
Domesticated. They're smaller, slightly.
Well, he did have a pet Sela he was very fond of.
Solid.
Sort of a fat teddy bear.
A teddy bear?
And of course, the animated yesteryear gives us the scene of young Spock being bullied.
Spock, you could never be a true Vulcan. That is not true. Your father brought shame to Vulcan. He married a human. You haven't even mastered a simple Vulcan neck pinch yet, Earther.
We see this scene echoed in the 2009 film, Star Trek.
He's a traitor, you know. Your father. For marrying her. That human whore.
The core of this bullied Spock idea came from the original series episode, Journey to Babel, where Mother Amanda mentioned Spock's difficult childhood.
When you were 5 years old and came home stiff-lipped, anguished, because the other boys tormented you, saying that you weren't really Vulcan. I watched you, knowing that inside, the human part of you was crying.
And finally, we get to see a little bit more of the Forge region in the 2019 Star Trek Discovery episode, If Memory Serves.
It began the night he ran away from our home. Deep into the forest of Vulcan's Forge and its many dangers.
Influence 2, Tiberius.
In the animated episode, Bem, the Enterprise visits a planet populated by pre-industrial people. An advanced alien observer, Commander Ari Ben Bem, secretly watches the Enterprise crew to determine if they are themselves advanced enough to contact. The episode is important for us because it marks the first time we hear Captain Kirk's middle name, Tiberius.
Who are you?
Who are you?
I am Captain James Tiberius Kirk of the Starship Enterprise. This is my first officer, Mr. Spock.
A change from whatever R stood for. We later get affirmation of that middle name in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country.
And now, we come to the architect of this tragic affair. James Tiberius Kirk.
And elsewhere, like the 2009 film, Star Trek.
What are we gonna call him?
We can name him after your father.
Tiberius? You kidding me? No, that's the worst.
Influence 3, the holodeck.
In the animated episode The Practical Joker, the Enterprise gets ambushed by 3 Romulan ships. They escape through an energy field, which in turn gives the Enterprise computer artificial intelligence. The enhanced ship's computer begins to play practical jokes on the crew, as most computers would naturally want to do. One of those practical jokes traps McCoy, Uhura, and Sulu in the Rec Room, otherwise known later in the franchise as the holodeck. The Rec Room, or Recreation Deck, represents the first appearance of the holodeck, which would later be reintroduced in Star Trek The Next Generation's pilot episode, Encounter at Farpoint. In his book, The World of Star Trek, written in 1973, original series writer David Gerrold mentions that the concept of a holodeck was supposed to be in the original Star Trek series. So in this case, the animated series was just tying up a loose end.
Influence 4, the counterclock incident.
In the counterclock incident, the Enterprise gets pulled into a universe where time runs backwards. The crew begins to regress into children. This episode establishes that Robert April was the first captain of the USS Enterprise before Captain Christopher Pike. Robert April was the original character pitched by Gene Roddenberry as the captain of the Enterprise. He was later changed to Christopher Pike, which was later replaced by James Kirk as Star Trek became established. It was never officially canonized until the animated series. Episode writer Fred Bronson, operating under the pseudonym John Culver, thought that bringing Robert April into the mythology would be a good move. Indeed, he wasn't the only one to think so. Robert April's position as captain before Christopher Pike and James Kirk was further cemented by references made in Star Trek Discovery.
List Starfleet's most decorated captains, living and deceased.
Working.
Based on their service records, is it possible to identify the qualities most essential to their success?
Other concepts from this episode wound up elsewhere in the franchise. Crew members de-aging into their younger selves was revisited in the Next Generation's Rascals.
Do not argue with me! Go back inside!
I need to see him now! Now!
A similar version of the backwards aging alien race in the counterclock incident is used in Voyager's Innocence, too.
You are all very fortunate to have escaped the crash with only a few bruises.
The attendants protected us.
Attendants?
Over time, lots of writers used Star Trek the Animated Series as a source for world building elsewhere in the franchise, including in beta canon, i.e. the Litverse. The life support belt would show up again in a Next Generation novel called The Peacekeepers. The animated characters Imres and Erix appear in a Star Trek New Frontier novel by Peter David. The animated episode The Jihad featured an alien race that would later appear in a novel from the Starfleet Corps of Engineers series, and in Alpha Canon Star Trek episodes, too. Deep Space Nine's Broken Link mentions Edosian orchids. The animated character Erix is an Edosian. Also in Deep Space Nine, the episode Once More Into the Breach mentions the name of Klothos as Kor's ship. This was first established in the animated episode The Time Trap, and it looks like the upcoming series Star Trek Lower Decks may feature a Caitian character, like Imres. Caitians have shown up once or twice in the background of the franchise since the animated series. And of course, Vulcan's Forge region gets name-dropped here and there. Beyond the Star Trek franchise, the impact of this original animated series can be seen sporadically. A satirization of Star Trek the Animated Series was done in The Secret Lives of Waldo Kitty in 1974. This featured a Captain Herc of the USS Starship Second Prize. And interestingly, an episode called New Girl in Town from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series delivered this.
We shouldn't be together, Ryan. It's against your fleet protocol.
Well, Celestial, you don't get to be captain of the Dauntless by following all the rules.
Good. Then you won't mind giving me the codes.
Celestial, you just broke my heart. But my disintegrator still works. At least I'll have these to remember her by.
Yeah. Cowabunga?
Oh, hello. Welcome to the credits. I'm Mark McCray, author of The Best Saturdays of Our Lives. This is my book that talks about how Saturday morning became a competitive business. This book was a passion project. I worked on it for about 2 years. Elements of this story and my story led to me working in the industry. I was part of the team that helped launch the Boomerang Network, and from there I went to the Cartoon Network, and I currently work for Adult Swim. So check it out, grab a copy. I think you will love what you're going to read. Let's get started. This video was based on an essay and presentation written by me. It was edited by Kyle Sullivan. All of the terrible graphics, those were done by Kyle Sullivan. Audio assistance provided by Patrick Sullivan, Emmaleigh Bailey, and Matt Webster. Narration was done by Kyle Sullivan. Camera work and lighting by Kyle Sullivan, Emmaleigh Bailey, and Matt Webster. Title graphics are based on the work of Dan King. If you like this and other essays on this channel, then consider supporting Trekspertise on Patreon. Patreon is the reason that this channel even exists. All those dollars you give them gets turned into terrible jokes and neon graphics. That's how it works. So if you want more of this, then swing by Patreon and become a supporter. Link is in the subspace below. Finally, we'd like to thank our patrons who make this whole thing possible, starting with special thanks to Hank Augustus, Iaponius, Saturnius. Additional thank you to our generous patrons, Paul Nash, David Radford, Alex Apshore, Troy Bernier, and Alex Blocker, and all of the other patrons who make this possible. Thank you. If you'd like to be notified when the next essay lands, then subscribe, turn on the notifications, and especially sign up for our no-nonsense email list. The email list is the most efficient method. You can find all of the relevant links down in the subspace below. Thank you, and see you soon.
遠い将来を考えてみようよ。